This is the Fix Your Sciatica podcast.
So this episode has been a long time coming. I have been, an avid rower ever since I started CrossFit, and then also ever since I've been working out on my own. And a fair amount of you listeners out there were interested in getting back into rowing. And rather than having you just listen to me speak, I thought, why not get a professional who has spent hours and hours, as much time on the rower as I have spent in the pool. So today I have Morgan Davis, who's an American record holder in rowing. And I actually got a chance to take a look at her stats this morning. It was extremely impressive, but she was kind enough to share her expertise on the efficiency and mechanics of rowing. So Morgan, good to see you. Thank you so much for being on today's episode.
Yeah, Ashley, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this because I have my theories or expectations of rowing. I'm a pretty analytical person, so as I spent more time in the rower, I was thinking, how can I maximize the efficiency? It was kind of like what I did when I was a collegiate swimmer, where every single race and every single practice, yes, I knew that I had to work my muscles, but if things were actually really hurting or I wasn't going as fast as I should, I had to think about, what am I doing right and what am I doing wrong, so I can actually maximize my swimming ability, so I can go faster, use less energy. And I think with the more time that I spent on the rower, it's very similar in that sense. And so I saw you pop up on YouTube talking about your background, and I was like, I got to interview her. So for the listeners out there who haven't heard of you or haven't met you, tell us a little bit more about yourself and the journey through rowing and what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I'm from Georgia. I am married to a guy named Corey. We've been married for 8 years now, just celebrated our 8th year. And so Corey started a gym when he was in grad school at UGA. And I had, been in athletics, all my life, and I went to college at UGA and fell out of, my healthy habits and quit exercising. And finally one day I was like, I have got to get back into the gym. And I had tried a couple of other things, and this girl from high school had posted on Facebook about this local gym I had never heard of right down the road from me. And so I stumbled in there, and it was Core Blend Training, which again, it's my husband's gym that he started in grad school, and I fell in love with it. And one of the things that was a part of his gym was the row machine. They had really enjoyed it for a number of different reasons, and I just took to it. I really liked it. And so that's kind of how I got and just stayed involved with it. And so yeah, that's kind of like how I started. And then me being competitive and missing the competitive sports, I was like, hey, what else can I do? And Corey was like, they post records online. I was like, all right, well, let's give it a shot. How far off am I? And so just kind of worked towards that, just had a goal to get better at it, and then just really enjoy it as part of my fitness routine.
Very cool. What a journey to transition. It's like, I think what has been very cool for, I guess, our generation now is that we have opportunities to pursue competitive sports outside of high school and college, where our parents' generation didn't really have that. And to be able to have like these records and these things for us to pursue has always been really great. And congratulations on 8 years of marriage.
Thank you.
This December 1st, is actually going to be our 7-year wedding anniversary. So
Right.
we're right behind you. And
Nice,
so
very nice.
yeah, and wow, so what a cool story. So it's like you had the opportunity, it's like, okay, there are a bunch of records for you to check out. Tell us a little bit more about, once you figured out, okay, there's a record I want to pursue. What was that record that you broke or hold? And tell us a little bit more about how you prepared for that, because as an adult, like, we have responsibilities, right? Like, we have our job, we have our family and life responsibilities. How were you able to actually fit in, let me go ahead and pursue a record while being a full-fledged human being in society.
Yeah, for sure. So I looked at it and I kind of just took the times that I was like, here are my current times. What am I close to? And the first one was the 500 meter row time for the American record. And at the time, with Concept 2, in their records, you basically have a lightweight and you have a heavyweight division. And so I was looking at the lightweight, which is under 135 pounds. And so I was like, awesome, I fit right into that. I'm close to this. Okay, now what do I need to do? And so like as I was practicing for the 500, it's definitely more of a sprint as opposed to an endurance. So then we kind of looked at, all right, what am I lacking now here? And part of it was my strength. Like I was not, when I was doing my 500 meters, the cardiovascular aspect of it was fine. Like my chest, my lungs felt fine, but really it was my leg strength and my upper back strength. So as I was looking like, okay, how do I break this? Saying, okay, well, I also need to focus more again on putting more emphasis in my strength training with my legs and my upper back. Because those were the weaknesses. And then so from there kind of built out a plan to say, okay, realistically, I have 5 days a week that I can get in, 30 minutes, maybe an hour of training. We were expanding our gym. At the time, my family also had a restaurant that we were running, so it was just like a lot going on, so I just did not have a ton of time to devote to it. So really we focused on, okay, here we're going to strength train, for just a little bit of time, 3 days a week, and then we're going to do, 2 specific rowing conditioning interval workouts that made sense to like get me to really focus on that 500 meters. Again, it's really a sprint. Like if you look at kind of all of the different records, it is definitely on the shorter end. So how can I make sure I'm putting enough power into the rower and just making sure my technique isn't breaking down during that time? So we focused on those other 2 days. And then within, honestly, I think it was like maybe like a month and a half, and then I was able to break the record. So that was kind of the journey through the 500 meters, and then did a very similar thing with the 1000 was the next one that I went for. And again, it wasn't something that I was that far away from, but we had to change up the training a little bit just because it was a little bit, but really it came down to how can I be most efficient in my programming with the limited amount of time that I had. And luckily Corey, my husband, was a phenomenal programmer and just was able to work with me and say, okay, here are your weaknesses, what are we going to do to get like the most bang for your buck, and then how are we going to transfer that over into your rowing. And so like I said, within a couple of months was able to have both of those. Recently it got broken not too long ago. My 500 did by like 1/10 of a second. So I'm like, oh, man. So I'm gonna have to go back and try to reclaim that title.
Defending your titles are always fun, I guess, if I should say that, right? But man, what a cool journey. I'm not an American record holder. I remember I'm a retired college swimmer, and early on in my CrossFit career, I was doing competitive CrossFit, and then my friends who are still my friends, but my friends at the time were also ex-college swimmers, and we decided, hey, let's try to shoot for a New Jersey record in one of these relays. And so it was really funny because we were just doing CrossFit, and then we would swim maybe like once every couple of weeks, and then we'd show up to the swim meet, break this record. It was a lot of fun, but anyway, nothing compared to the preparation that you had to do. But you brought up a couple of really important concepts in that. Number one was the specificity we call it specificity of training in the strength conditioning world, but also just being able to see like, what is the specific goal? So whether it be the 500, the 1000, or even when it comes to trying to overcome pain, is like, we have to figure out, well, what's the goal? What are we trying to do? And so for the 500, you're looking at a race which is going to be below 2 minutes, which means that you have to focus a lot more on power and a lot more on strength. And I'm glad that you were able to do that. I'm glad that you had someone there to help you determine that as well. So it's like, okay, here's the scenario. And obviously, you had to change the strategy up when you went into the 1,000 because it was a much longer race. And listeners, when you are going through a pain recovery journey, you have to determine what is the goal. If the first goal is getting out of pain, you have to do everything you can to reduce the pain. It's not we need to get these muscles stronger, we need to get these muscles looser. It's what can we do to bring the pain down? And that's one of the biggest lessons that I got from you explaining your journey to that. The second part is as you start to break these specifics down, it made me start really thinking about we call it the concept of how rather than like the what. And so it wasn't just like, okay, Morgan, you got to row more, you got to row harder to get a faster time. I'm sure that there's going to be some sort of technical component that we'll talk about shortly. We really, it's addressing how you're doing things, which improves the efficiency, which then it gets addressed through everything else. And then the third piece is the prioritization. Yeah, you were extremely busy. If you can only fit 30 to 40 minutes of training 5 times a week, that's all you could do. So it's like you're really maximizing the time that you have available, which I do appreciate, which the reality is you're a testament to like what can be possible. Like you can get things done by doing just 30 to 40 minutes 5 times a week. I think a lot of people look at programs or look at goals and think, well, I got to put in the swimming world, we call it garbage yardage. You can put a lot of garbage yardage into everything, but you really don't have to, especially if you're training correctly, you're training specifically, and you're doing things right. So speaking of doing things right, Morgan, let's talk about like the muscles involved, right? We know that rowing is like a very good exercise from a cardiovascular standpoint, but I also believe that it's a fantastic way for us to really train our muscles. It's a fantastic machine. So tell us a little bit more about the main muscles worked in rowing.
Yeah, it truly is a great full body movement and exercise. Like you said, like obviously from the cardiovascular standpoint, but you have your quads are working, your glutes are working, you have pretty much your entire like posterior chain. So your lats, those are involved, your forearms. So pretty much like every muscle except I would say kind of like your pressing muscles, like your chest, stuff like that. But like outside of that, pretty much everything else is being worked when you do the row because it is such a full body movement. So I don't know how much more specific you want to go into it, but it truly is like you get off and you're like, oh, man, I am beat, I am worn out, truly.
I love rowing. I think it was one of the first pieces of exercise equipment that I purchased in the pandemic, actually. So I actually used to own a gym and was part of a bunch of gyms from like 2014 to 2020. And every gym I was in, they were CrossFit gyms and functional fitness gyms. Like I always ensured that there were rowers there. But then when I moved out here to California and I didn't have a gym of my own, I was like, okay, well, I can drive 30 minutes to the nearest gym to me, or I can have the gym at home. And COVID certainly accelerated that. But yeah, I purchased my own concept too. And I spent a lot of time on the rower. And I thought it was such a fantastic machine. I still have it and I still use it to this day. And 100%, it uses a lot of muscles. And it really made me think, okay, like, am I doing this right? And so after watching like video after video and again, being an analytical person, I was like, all right, well, how can I really maximize the leverage that I have? And I'm glad that you brought up the posterior chain. And a lot of people hear the posterior chain and it's like, okay, well, what is that? It's all the muscles on the backside. So we have our back extensors, we have our glutes, our hamstrings, and our lats as well. And one of the things that I've noticed, a lot of folks who are dealing with back pain and sciatica, they usually fall into 2 specific categories. Either that they use their back muscles too much and they're rounding at the back a lot and they're using those muscles. It's like you'll notice it's like when people are standing there and like there's like this huge divot of where their spine is, and then you have like these 2 big pieces. Listeners, I want you to visualize if you're like, what are these muscles on my back? Or if you're a meat eater, filet mignon is a muscle that runs on the backside of the cow. It's a very tender muscle, But I want you to think about like your back muscles or even your hip flexors to kind of be like the flame on there. It's this long muscle, which is used to really just more so sustain a position, not actually generate a lot of movement. And so one of the challenges that we have when we're trying to use our backs a lot is the fact that our back muscles, specifically the multifidus and the erectors, they cross multiple joints and they're really used specifically for stability. They can generate movement, but we can generate a lot more force and power through our glutes and our hamstrings. So when you're in that realm of you're using your back too much, you're really neglecting your glutes and your hamstrings, which can generate a lot of power, and that could be a contributing part of the pain that you're dealing with. The second realm that we're looking at is the folks who aren't using their back enough, or they're not stabilizing their back. And if you're not stabilizing the back, what I often find is that there's a lot of motion in your spine specifically. And when there's a lot of motion, I want you to think like it's not just like a door hinge, which it kind of just moves on the hinge itself. I want you to think about taking your two fists together and then just rubbing them side by side. You get a little friction and what we call shear force. And that friction and shear force can actually create a little bit of that irritation and can actually cause a lot of pain as well. And that often happens if you're not using your stabilizers enough or you're not using your posterior chain enough. And the posterior chain is a fantastic set of muscles, specifically your glutes and hamstrings. I think as an American society, we don't use them enough. And so to be able to have a rowing machine like the Concept 2 gives us the opportunity to really use them and train them as well. So let's talk about like the main components of like an execution standpoint. A lot of people think like they're just going to go and they're going to go on the rower and then they're just going to go rowing, right? But there's certainly more to it. When you're teaching beginners or people who are like, I want to get back into rowing or get into rowing, what are some of the main components that from a form standpoint do you share with those folks?
Yeah, so I would say a lot of times people will try to begin pulling with their arms before they even push with their legs. So that is one thing that we see. So really what people need to think about is you are pushing through the rower, pushing back, let your legs extend, and then really it's a pull from that standpoint. Just did, I think the video that you're referencing earlier, we broke down all of this. So if people want to go find that on YouTube, and then we talk about the common mistakes. But if they don't want to do that, pretty much when you're in, you're starting in, it's called the catch position. So basically where you're all the way forward, you want vertical shins, and you want to have your back in a neutral position. So you're nice and tall, you're nice and upright, so you're not rounding forward or anything like that. And then so how the movement starts is you're going to push back and your arms are completely straight starting out. And once that handlebar gets to your knees, then that's when you start initiating the pull with your arms. And then you continue to push through until your legs are completely straight, locked out. And at that back part of the movement, then you complete that pull, and the handlebar comes into your chest area or like your rib cage area, really. And then you essentially reverse that movement and come back in. And you always want to lead with your arms instead of your butt. So making sure when you go to reverse that movement that you don't start with your legs. So you lean back up forward and then come back in. Let those arms lead you forward. It's a little hard to describe like audibly, but like I said, like there's some great resources out there. I am biased, but you can definitely go check out our YouTube video if you want to learn technical like specifics with rowing in general.
When I teach people how to row, I like to think, I'll usually say it like legs, hips, arms, hips, legs, and kind of like go through that. And what I really love about rowing is the fact that it is a very repetitive motion. And so it gives people a lot of opportunities to practice and hone that skill. I think a lot of people just think, okay, they can just go on and just really just start rowing, but there's a lot to it. You brought up this concept of a vertical shin, which I really appreciate, because one of the things that I would often see, especially when I would go to other gyms and people who are dealing with pain when rowing, is that their shins would actually lead. So I want you listeners, like vertical means that like if you're sitting at a tabletop, if you were to take your phone or a spoon and just have it go straight up and down, you're making a right angle on both sides. So that's what vertical is in regards to the plane. If you look at the foot pedals of the Concept 2 rower, they're angled. They're not straight up. They're not completely flat. So you want to be able to have like a vertical shin, aka just straight up and down. And what I found to be particularly interesting with that position, Morgan, you let me know if I'm correct, but once the shins leave that vertical plane, oftentimes people's like butt or like the seat will actually clip people in the ankles. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes when you get clipped in the ankles, one, it's not pleasant, especially if you don't wear socks that are high enough to cover your ankles. But also two, when you have the seat clip your ankles, you actually lose a lot of that tension and stability in your back. So you end up getting into that curve. And it's like when your body goes into like a neutral or straight spine into a curve and then back into a straight, that's where we're talking about a lot of that excessive motion. And excessive motion of the back can actually lead to irritation and pain. But then also it's not very efficient. You are going to be elevating your heart rate more than you should, and you're going to be getting tired a lot faster because it's also not the most efficient way to engage the muscles and row. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Does that sound about right before I continue?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, it's what we see, and that's what you said too. Like once you get out of that position, and then when you're all the way in your back, if you do lead with that butt, then you put yourself back into your clipping, especially like again when you're in that starting position, and it's just super uncomfortable. I don't recommend that at all.
This episode is brought to you by the Sciatica Protocol. Experience pain relief directly through your phone, anytime, anywhere. Interested in learning more? Check us out at ifixyoursciatica.com/the-sciatica-protocol.
Then we move on into like the technical, I guess like the application of force. So listeners, what's interesting is that there's different types of movement or like resistance that machines can provide. One is going to be called isotonic, which means that the resistance will be consistent throughout the range of motion. There is another term which is called isokinetic, which means that the speed of whatever's moving will stay consistent. And what that means is, say for example, the rowing machine Concept 2 is actually what we call an isokinetic machine, meaning that it tries to keep the speed of the handle going out of the flywheel consistent, which means that the harder you pull on the handle, the harder it will pull back on you. And so a lot of people will think that when they get onto the rower, they need to put the damper setting up to like a level 10, right? And so, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. And so the idea is that as you're going through this sequence, you're driving through your legs, you're pulling through your arms in the sequence of what Morgan described, and you actually have the opportunity to feel a lot of the resistance. But that's where you can actually really express a lot of the strength that your body does have. And so tell us a little bit more about like how important like the rhythm is, and like how important it is to actually like stay the current sequence and to be really patient on like the arm pull and everything.
Yeah. So if you, again, I mean, I think it comes down to being efficient with your stroke and using, like a lot of times, like if you're going to start the pull and you're starting with, your upper body, if you're trying to engage your lats like right away, you're starting with a muscle that just in general, it's just not as strong as say your quads. And so you want to start with the muscle that is stronger and can put more force into that initial pull. And then as you have that momentum, and then using, your lats to kind of finish out that movement. Like I said, it kind of comes down to just being more efficient with it and using your strength to your advantage. And then getting into a good rhythm where then as you're coming back in, you don't want to wait too long. I mean, we can get like into like the flywheel and everything like that, but you want to be able to come in and come right back out again, to use almost like a momentum as you're coming in and out. Again, going back to just being more efficient. You don't want to let that flywheel completely stop where you have to get it going again. And so yeah, you want to try to be the most efficient that you can, and that's really it. Making sure you have a good solid pool, and that you're initiating it correctly, and then that you're not really waiting too long once you're back in that starting that catch position.
And so, listeners, if you're going and you're rowing, you're like, man, this is a lot harder than it should be. Then it's probably the case. And so, let's flip the script a little bit in regards like transition from like the performance of rowing to say the dreaded, okay, I'm hurt and I'm injured. Now, you certainly, again, you had like your 5 times a week, but it was like 30 to 40 minutes. You were busy. Either yourself or people that you've been around have experienced their fair share of injuries. And so tell us a little bit more about like when it came to an injury with rowing. This was like your main sport. This is something where you were really focusing on trying to get the American record. So one, have you gone through your fair share of injuries? And if so, like how did you overcome that? Or if you knew people who had gone through it?
Yeah, and this is where like I would love to get your input about different things. But so for me personally, one, really try to focus on injury prevention more than anything. Whether that is making sure that we have proper warm-ups, proper cool downs, everything like that. But then also like, where are you weak? Like if you have, like for me, I really haven't experienced too many injuries. I will say after giving birth though, to our little boy, especially just my core in general was super weak and having to rebuild that back up. So that was probably like my closest like thing related to an injury. But so with that, I was like, okay, what do I need to be doing strength training wise to put myself back into a better position? I didn't need to row when I first came back because of the angle. That was just not good. I was trying to avoid having any diastasis and stuff like that. So I switched and did the bike for a little bit, where it just put me into, a position that was not affecting, my low back and stuff like that. And so, again, we kind of look at that from like an injury prevention standpoint. What are you going through? How can we make sure that we are properly warming up, cooling down, doing the correct strength training, and then pivoting if there is something that is an issue. And then as far as coming in, and if somebody does have an injury, it really kind of depends on the severity of the injury and where that injury is located. If you're talking about like a back specific injury, one, we want to know why that injury occurred. And is it because of a weakness? Is it because of a technical thing? What happened with that injury? And then what are kind of like your steps to improve upon it? And then again, with going back to like the rowing specifically, are you able to do that movement? And maybe we need to just drop the intensity down. Like you don't need to be rowing on a damper that's a 10. Let's put you at a 1, and let's decrease the amount of time that you're spending on the rower, stuff like that. And then outside of that, are you working with a PT? Are you working with a chiropractor? What are you doing like outside of your gym time to help improve that injury? And how can we, assist them in doing that? Doing the proper strength training. And then if we need to avoid the rower completely, there's other pieces of conditioning equipment that we could pivot to get the cardiovascular aspect, from that you would normally get from the rower. And then if you're looking more from the strength component, is it something that, again, we can do that you're getting done in PT work, or you're getting from a chiropractor? What kind of are you doing? Basically kind of breaking down what you're getting from the rower and how can we get that from other places that, while you're in the healing process. I know that's kind of broad, But that's what we've seen and what we've personally done.
And I can't agree with you more. I'm a huge fan of what you just described. I think the number one theme of what you just shared with us is the importance of, I like to call it a team effort, where it's like you work with your PTs and your chiros, but then also you're working with your strength coaches and your trainers to be able to implement as much as possible. Oftentimes we think that we can get things done by ourselves, and I'm guilty of it myself, to be able to say like, okay, here's this problem, let me go ahead and just mull it over, let me go ahead and get it done without asking for help. And I realize that when I don't ask for help, I end up making a lot more mistakes before things start to become more successful. And then looking back thinking, if I just had a coach or had a PT chiro, if I had someone who knew more than me to actually walk me through it, I would have avoided a lot of these pitfalls. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. As you were going through your process, it made me think about these three main components in both injury prevention and then also recovering from an injury, especially when trying to get back into some sort of physical activity. The first piece is what we call introspection. So for you, congratulations on your baby boy. And once you gave birth, you were looking at, well, what am I capable of? Is this activity going to be okay for me? And what's interesting is a lot of folks think, man, I have to have a lot of technical knowledge about some sort of specific activity before I get back into it. And no one knows your body better than you. And so when you're trying to look at, is this a safe activity for me to return to? Look at what you're capable of and then compare it to what is required from that specific activity. Childbirth and having to do that lean back, yeah, it is a fair amount of pressure on the core, and you did a very great job of saying, okay, I'm not quite ready for that yet, let me build up. So being able to look within, and I think as a society or as a human race, we are very good at overlooking or ignoring those cues from our bodies, saying like we've had enough. And I've said this in plenty of other podcast episodes. It allows us to do some pretty incredible things because we're able to push past that fatigue, that exhaustion, that pain, to allow us to get American records, right? It's like, no dog is going to be like, I want to push beyond this exhaustion or this pain. It's really driven by the human person. So that's number one. The second part of it is we call it the modification, or it's like the pivoting, as you said, like you want to get back into rowing, but you weren't quite ready, so you switched to using the air bike. And the air bike gets you the cardiovascular benefits, gets your legs moving, but doesn't put you in that compromised position for the diastasis. But then there was a point in time where you developed enough strength for you to be able to get back onto the rower. And then the third component is what I like to call modulation. It's where you are going to be changing the amount of time or the intensity of what you're doing. You're going to be doing that activity that you want to do, but you are going to be changing the parameters on how much you're doing it. And it allows us to safely get back into those activities, specifically something like rowing. Again, it's like, as Morgan said, you don't necessarily have to crank it up to a damper setting of 10. You can bring it down to a 1, get your body moving, get more comfortable, and you can start increasing either the resistance, the damper setting, how hard you push, or even the length of time that you're doing it. So, but you brought up this concept of like warm-ups and cool-downs. It's interesting. So as a physical therapist and even as an athlete, I always hated warm-ups and cool-downs. I remember, and I was just reflecting on my wife because we were both college swimmers. I was like, my pre-race warm-up would probably be about 2,000 yards, but it would just be like me moving. And then I hated cool downs. They're like, okay, now you got to swim in like the cool down pool. And I'm like, I'm so tired. I'm just going to sit. And I'm pretty sure that I would have swam a lot faster if I actually took my warm-ups and cool downs much more seriously. But hindsight's always 20/20. So let's talk about like some of your favorite warm-ups and cool downs for rowing.
Yeah, I definitely, I would love to say I'm like really good at all my warm-ups and cool downs. I try to be, but sometimes I'm like, I don't feel like doing this, but I always feel better. And I definitely can avoid injuries when I actually do them. But as far as like for rowing specifically, I would say it's very similar to really any other like lower body, or if I was like going for a run or like something like that. Pretty much my warm up for that row is very similar. So I start by doing some form of like SMR or body tempering. I don't know actually if you've heard of body tempering by Donnie Thompson came up with the concept
I
of
have.
it.
For the audience, share with us a little bit more about what that is.
So I guess like very basically, it's very very similar to like a foam rolling, like I said, SMR, so self myofascial release. Very similar to that, but for with body tempering, you're able to be in a completely relaxed position, and then like weight of pressure is applied to you. So kind of like a massage as well, but instead of a human being that's actually doing the pressing, you typically have a type of tool. You can do it with something like a kettlebell. Donnie Thompson always talked about like steel pipes. Corey actually invented something called the forge, where it's a plate loadable piece of metal that you can put like clips on, like very similar to a barbell. And so you're able to be in a relaxed position and then have that pressure applied to you. So like I said, kind of very similar to like foam rolling or a massage, but I think personally you're in a little bit better of a position, and can have more force applied to you.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. So you're getting some sort of soft tissue work leading up to it, or like
Yeah.
that's step number one is like getting your tissues ready.
Right. And
Yeah.
so doing that and then moving into some form of dynamic lower body movements that, again, not a static stretching, but something that will be loosening up, and then doing things like either like pogo hops, something like that, just continuing to move, loosen up specifically for lower body. We'll do a little bit of upper, dynamic work, but specifically more in the lower end. And then I'll move into the rower and go through just some very light, anywhere from 2 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe 10 if I'm about to do like a longer warm, or just moving through and getting my body ready for that specific movement that I'm about to do. And then basically in the cool down, it's almost like reverse of that. In with the in with the movement that I'm doing, so rowing, and then move into like, okay, let me either do like a cool down like walk or a jog, or like just something to continue moving, and then I would go into the SMR form again, so kind of like reversing that for the cool down.
Very cool. The warm up itself, we're looking at getting our tissues ready, specifically the tissues that are actually going to be doing the most amount of work, which is going to be our muscles, get them a little bit more awake. But then muscles are only awake as much as the nervous system, our brain body connection. So you're having those pogo hops, those activities that are actually going to be activating those muscles a little bit more. And then I really appreciate you breaking down like what the cool down is pretty much everything in reverse to kind of like bring everything back down. Personally speaking, not as a physical therapist, but as like as an athlete, warm-ups and cool downs were always really the bane of my existence. And so as I was looking at it, I was thinking, why do I dislike warm-ups and cool downs so much? Because I'm thinking, well, I only have so much time allotted to working out, like being a parent myself. It's like, okay, I only probably have an hour of doing things. And I remember back in my early CrossFit days, people would mobilize for about 45 minutes before their workout. We would have like 2-hour training sessions. And now I'm like, all I want is an hour, right? And then so it got me thinking a little bit more. And I'm like, well, I'm a physical therapist. Like I should tell people why it's so important to warm up. And it got me thinking that if you live a pretty sedentary life, you're working in an office, you're sitting down for a long period of time, it actually is very important for you to spend more time warming up, because you go from not moving at all to moving a ton. And so it's prudent for you to be able to have that, and as well as the cool down, because to go from like doing a whole bunch of activity to just sitting for the rest of the day, your body is in fact going to get tight and get irritated. So do as I say, not as I do. But if you are someone who actually is on their feet for a long period of time and is like walking around, like you might actually be able to afford having a shorter warm up and cool down, because you're not going to be going from like a dead stop to activity to a dead stop. So yeah, and then so through your experience, right? Like as you said, like it really depends on the injury and where people are coming from, and also the communication of the throughout the team. At what point, or how do you determine when it's a good time to actually start ramping things up, or when it's like, oh, we should back off a little bit? I think the modulation in regards to like how much volume or how much you do or how intensely you go, not too many people, and I even see it in the physical therapy and chiropractic community, where they're like, oh, just take it easy. So from a programming standpoint, like what are some like key, I guess, helpful components to have people understand how and when it's the right time to ramp up, how much to ramp up, and how do we keep track of our progress like that?
Yeah, so I would say really with coming back from an injury, one, it would be like, are you pain free? And if you're not, then okay, well, we need to readdress that. And if you're pain free, then saying, okay, well, then looking at how are you recovering? How are you feeling in the next like couple of days afterwards? And if, if somebody's coming in and saying like, yeah, like I feel good, like I'm not having any pain, I'm not really sore, like all that stuff, then we'll look at saying, okay, well, let's adjust the volume and then see how you feel after that. And then continue to do that way, to ramp it up that way. And then also in that process saying, okay, like what are your goals going back? Like, okay, was the goal just to be pain free and we've achieved that? All right, well then let's set the next goal. Is your next goal like, are you going for something, or is rowing now just part of your program, and then we're just building over time and we program it out, something like that. But really tracking how they are feeling after doing the workouts, and then adjusting the intensity with that as well, and making sure that they're recovering properly from all of it. And then as far as like tracking it, for us personally, what we do is we have an app that we have our programming, and people put in what they're doing and they can rate how they feel, they can make notes on it, stuff like that. So we're able to look, over time, what they were doing before they were injured, what's happening after they were injured, and kind of what is like, look at it from a holistic standpoint. Because within that app too, we can see, they can put in, how are they sleeping, they can do their nutrition, they can put in all the other components that kind of go into recovery and just nutrition, working out, everything all together. So that's kind of how we track it over time, and how we would make adjustments for people coming back off an injury as well.
I appreciate that you have something that can actually like track people's progress. I think I know that the interactions I have with some of the clients, or even the prospective clients who come my way, they look at their pain as like, I have pain or I don't have pain. They look at it as like a light switch. And then the same thing when it comes to like the return to activity, it's like, am I doing activity or am I doing not? And the reality is, and this is going to be across the injury, rehab to performance spectrum, is that everything will operate on a spectrum. And so if you are having pain, we have to take a look in regards to like, well, how much pain? Where's the pain located? Like, where there are all these different components. It's the same thing that actually when we transition into the performance and activity, it's how are you feeling? How much are we doing? How intense are we pushing ourselves? And so being able to keep track of, in essence, the data allows us to make some better informed decisions in regards to what do we need to do to either focus on recovery, or we can push ourselves a little bit more. In addition to that, I like to think in regards to like time. How long will it take for me to get back into feeling like myself? And I would usually say the general rule of thumb is it'll be 1 week for every month that you have been out of said activity. So for example, if you've been dealing with your pain for say a year, you're looking at least 12 weeks of building up to the point where you're going to be feeling somewhat remotely to yourself. So that's going to be kind of like our baseline. So it's like, all right, we're going to say a year, that means 12 weeks. How do we work backwards from there? Realistically speaking, I usually start off with increasing about 5 to 15%, depending on how focused on people's recovery there is. And so if you're someone who is undersleeping, but you are feeling better and better each day, we might actually be increasing about 5% each week, maybe a little bit more depending on, again, how you're feeling. And in order for us to be able to see how you're doing, we have to track it day over day or even week over week. And the third piece is that we have to change one factor at a time. And so whether it be like doing more of that activity or spending more time, or doing that, or changing up the intensity, how hard we're going. And so the challenge is if you change both factors at the same time, it's really hard for us to determine, was it the increase in time that actually made things a little bit more problematic, or was it the increase in intensity that made things more problematic? And so if we can take those components, the length of time, work backwards from there, change the intensity and also the volume, we have a much more structured way of being able to return back into, say, physical activity. I also have failed to note, listeners, the video that we're referencing in regards to Morgan's instructional is found on YouTube. I'm actually going to be putting that link into the show notes so you can take a look at it. I learned a lot from that video, and I highly recommend that you take a look at it as well. As we're starting to wrap up, tell us a little bit more for the folks who are like, okay, Morgan, rowing doesn't really seem scary. It seems a lot more technical than it is. I think I want to get into it because, as Morgan and Ashley have said during this episode, there's an opportunity for us to be able to get into rowing safely. What are some key components or tips that the beginner rower or the person getting back into rowing, what are some things that they need to consider before literally hopping back onto the rower?
Yeah, so I would say, how are you feeling? What type of injury are you coming back from? Looking at all of that, starting off slowly, and giving yourself some grace and saying, I'm not going to be perfect at this. This is going to feel awkward. This is going to feel hard at first. And that's okay. And knowing that's okay. And starting off slow, starting off if you get more and more into the rowing, figuring out where your damper setting actually needs to be, talking about drag factor and all of that, good technical stuff, but not really worrying about that, starting off lower where that resistance type of feel is not as heavy, and then starting off slow with shorter intervals with a longer amount of rest time, and continuing to ease that back in, and then asking for help as far as somebody to break down your form for you, especially if you're coming off of an injury, specifically talking about an injury with your back, making sure that, going back to saying where your butt is not coming in and you have that route, making sure there is somebody there that can look at that for you and say, hey, you're doing this, you probably need to change that, because it is hard, especially if for a beginner, to be able to look at themselves and saying, yep, I'm doing this perfectly, just by looking at a YouTube video, unless you're, I would either film yourself, like I said, or get a coach that can actually be there to observe and help you, where you're setting yourself up for the best outcome, and can help tweak things before you get in there and then you're doing it incorrectly and you either re-injure yourself or you hurt something else. So all that to say, I would start slow, get a coach or have somebody that is able to help you through, and can coach you starting out, and then work your way up from there. And then once you kind of get a hang of things, if you needed to drop that coach, you could, but I still have people that coach my form, and still look at everything for me, even though I've been doing this for a number of years now. It's always helpful to have. So
give yourself some grace, listeners, as you pursue something new or resume something that you've been doing after being laid off due to an injury. But then most importantly, you don't have to do this alone. Speaking of not doing things alone, Morgan, I think that your company does some pretty cool things with folks pretty much all throughout the country. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we have in Georgia, we have 3 physical locations, but we also do online training. So either just writing a program for somebody, or we will do one-on-one coaching. We'll do video reviews, stuff like that. So really we can tailor it to whatever the person needs, and we will have a conversation with you and say, okay, what are you looking to do? What are your goals? Is there a time frame around them? Let's talk about injuries, and we'll go through that whole entire thing, it like if we were talking to you one-on-one, face-to-face, and you were coming into our gym. We'll talk about what equipment you have, all of that good stuff, and we'll build you out a program and help guide you along. And so if you're wanting, if somebody's interested in that, my email is morgan@corblintraining.com. We also, you can go to our website, which is corblintraining.com, and there's a form that you could fill out. And my husband, actually, Corey, gets those, and so we'll match you with whoever that you need to be with to help achieve your goals. And we are more than happy to also work with any, PT, chiropractor, whoever else in your realm that you are working with, especially coming off of an injury. We're more than happy to speak with them and say, okay, let's work together to get whoever back into feeling good and back into shape and where they want to be.
Beautiful listeners. If you did not get a chance to write that down, I'm going to put the link into the show notes. Morgan, this has been awesome. I can talk to you about performance movement all day, and hopefully this will be one of many episodes that we have together. Thank you so much for dedicating the time. We're recording this episode the day after Thanksgiving, and Morgan was really kind enough after all the travel that she's done, and then also a little bit more travel. So it's great to see you, and thank you so much for being a guest on today's show.
Yeah, thank you again so much for having me, and thanks to all the listeners out there. So looking forward to the next time.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you got some help from today's podcast. And for more info, check us out at ifixyoursciatica.com. Have a fantastic and pain-free day. No patient-therapist relationship is formed by listening to this podcast. We are not providing medical advice, and all information should be confirmed by a medical provider.